Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our session, The Cost of Not Caring, What Companies Lose Without a Caregiving Culture. My name is Christine, and I am the Partner Marketing Manager at Culture Amp. My belonging badges are multiracial and pet person. Before we get started with our discussion, I want to share an important message. One of our values at Culture Amp is having the courage to be vulnerable. Co-creating a better world of work requires us to be open to new ways of doing things and finding the courage to lean in to have honest and authentic conversations. We recognize some topics might be uncomfortable because we all have different lived experiences. Our intention is always to be inclusive, so if you feel like there is something missing that we should be thinking about, please let us know after the session. In the meantime, we appreciate everybody maintaining a respectful and welcoming space for this community. And now I would love to introduce you to Lauren, Diane, Carolyn Frey. Lauren is the COO and co-founder of Cocoon, and Carolyn is the Chief People Officer. Cocoon is one of our wonderful sponsors of today's events, and we're so excited to have you both joining us today. And now over to you, Lauren.
Amazing. Thank you, Christine. And so excited to have Carolyn with me today in this conversation on the cost of not caring, because Carolyn and I have known each other for a long time. Even as Carolyn was transitioning from being a leader at Phil's to Curology and now Hungryroot. And I think this is a topic that we've talked a lot about together one-on-one as well. And really appreciate Christine sharing the value about the courage to be vulnerable, because I think this is a topic which is really vulnerable for a lot of us. And I'll just share kind of the space that I'm in, and I'd love to kind of kick it off to you, Carolyn, to share why this topic matters to you. In terms of my morning, I will first of all share that it was a very hectic morning with my little 9-month-old clinging to me as I was attempting to get out of the door for our board meeting at 9 a.m. And so a big part of why this topic really matters to me is that I'm a parent and a relatively new parent and still struggling to figure that out for myself as being a founder, being a parent at the same time. And I think the other area that I'm thinking a lot about is really just when it comes to caregiving, it's not just about parenting. And my founding story of Cocoon is a lot about that journey of becoming a parent, but also something that I haven't shared as much is also caring for older family members. And I just want to share a quick anecdote here before handing it off to you, Carolyn, to share more about why this topic connects to you. Because for me, one of the reasons that caregivers as a community really, really matter to me is because of my mom. And my mom is from China originally. And when I was sharing with her the idea for starting Cocoon and supporting folks through leave, she shared with me one of her stories that I really didn't have an understanding of before, when my grandma was diagnosed with cancer. And it was during that time that my mom had considered taking a caregiver leave, but didn't ultimately take it because of a lot of just fears of stigma and career opportunities, especially being ESL and a scientist. And it was something that she really deeply regretted afterwards. And when I think about why this topic matters to me, at its heart, the big piece is how do we enable folks to have these experiences with their loved ones without regret and with as much presence as possible, while also doing the work and the impact that we have in our day-to-day. So Carolyn, I'd love to just hear from you in terms of why this topic matters to you.
Thank you so much, Lauren, for inviting me to this conversation. This topic matters to me for similar reasons to you. I've got a 10-year-old girl, a 5th grader, and then a 6-year-old boy, 1st grader. So we're in a totally different stage of parenting that, and similar to Lauren, this morning was just crazy. My husband is traveling for work, so I'm single parenting this week. So stuffing bags with homework while calling into an exec meeting with, a tummy ache and for my daughter, and getting them to school was just wild. So really, really care deeply. And then I think on a personal level, my mom is totally blind. So I have just compassion and empathy and love for anyone that is full-time caregiving. She requires full-time care. She lost her eyesight slowly over her lifetime, but has been totally blind for the last 10 years. And so I have such appreciation and empathy through that experience and seeing kind of like what is required to care for her in life.
Thank you for sharing that space that you're in as well, Carolyn, because I know a lot of folks sometimes don't realize that all of us, despite kind of coming on camera and hopefully looking all right, have so much going on in the background. And I think just even that bit of personal share makes a big difference to a lot of folks on the line.
Completely agree. No, I always laugh at someone I go into a meeting. They're like, "Oh, you have it all together." I'm like, "You have no idea. You're not seeing the flames that are burning on the left and right side of me."
So true. So true. Well, I love that you shared the story of your mom, Carolyn, because I think a lot of times when we think about caregiving, we often do think of parents because it's kind of just the moment that folks, for example, going on a parental leave or welcoming a new child into the family is more something that's front and center in what we talk about in the workplace. But in your time as a people leader, whether it's at Hungryroot, whether it's at the prior companies that you've led, I'm sure that you've experienced and met people from all walks of life. And what I'd love to get a sense of from you is, what do you think of when you think about caregivers in the workplace, and what do their needs look like?
Yeah, thanks so much for asking. My first thought when I think of caregivers in the workplace is like, wow, like just amazing humans who are balancing a lot, who have like in general just like a high capacity to deal with a lot. So I think instantly what jumps out is like these are employees that we want to care for, not just because it's the right thing to do, but because they have a ton of capacity to deal with lots of things, work and personal related. So that's kind of the first thing that jumps out to me. I'm not sure what jumps out to you.
Yeah, I remember right before I gave birth to my 9-month-old, I was reading this LinkedIn post from a user of ours, and they said something along the lines of, "I've reached new heights of multitasking." And I was like, wow, I cannot wait to achieve that superpower. I would say I'm still very much on the journey there, but what you shared really resonates, Carolyn, in terms of caregivers. There's something about caregivers where the amount of responsibility on our plates is so meaningful that when we think about their potential for impact in the workplace, that really resonates to me as far as these are people who are able to have an impact in both their lives and also their work. And how do we help them figure out how to integrate that responsibility?
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think one thing that I'm curious about is oftentimes we don't talk about how many caregivers or just how prevalent caregivers are in the workforce, where I know during COVID, for example, we talked a lot about parents and parent ERGs and so forth, but actually a stat that kind of shocked me the other day was that 3/4 of employees in the US have some sort of current caregiving responsibility. And I think a lot of times we think about it as folks who are maybe younger in their 20s, for example, don't have any caregiving responsibilities. And especially in companies that are maybe more tech companies, for example, like Cocoon, a lot of times it does tend to be the case that it skews younger, for instance. But a lot of times we don't realize kind of behind the scenes who is a caregiver. And the fact that three out of the four of our people might be caregivers was really surprising to me. And what I'd love to kind of get a sense of is when, as a leader at Hungryroot right now and at your prior companies, what did that look like? And how did you talk about it in your conversations with leadership and exec as you think about the impact that this community is having?
Yeah, it was interesting that you mentioned that. I mean, I feel like COVID in so many ways was the great equalizer, but I think that was the moment. And I was at Phil's during the time where I realized, like, wow, so many of our workforce, I think your stat sort of tracks with my anecdotal information, are caregivers, whether that's parent, whether that's children. And frankly, in a lot of kind of either multi-generational living situations or roommate situations. So I have a roommate that I'm caring for and supporting. So it kind of opened my eyes to like the broad spectrum of what caregiving means. And then I think specific at Hungryroot, it's just has enabled me to like ask the right questions, have the right conversations. And I think you had alluded to it earlier, like destigmatize caregiving and really be really intentional about making sure our managers and leaders are supported to ask the right questions of kind of what does an employee need from a workplace or them and a manager to support kind of caring for all the things that are outside of, what we see on Zoom and at work day to day.
Absolutely. I think something that I've been thinking a lot about as well is exactly that piece, which is how do we empower caregivers to produce the best work that they can? And it's so challenging, right? Where you and I both this morning, for example, were dealing with this, childcare situations, and you mentioned, your daughter having a tummy ache, and navigating that while also being really present at what can often be a high stakes job environment too. And I think a lot, especially about my leaders at Cocoon. So, for instance, a number of our managers are caregivers. We actually got, for instance, one of our managers on a parental leave at the moment, and a lot of what I think about is what are those tools or needs that caregivers have that we may not necessarily know about or necessarily hear from them about on a day-to-day basis, but that are impacting their ability to do their best work. And how do we actually have the conversation in order to learn from them? What is it that they need there? And so I'd love to get a sense of, when you were kind of chatting with managers, for example, or your leadership, what do you encourage them to do to better understand the needs of caregivers and some of the challenges that they might be going through?
One of the things I really credit our CEO and founder at Hungryroot with is just like this concept of, it's not a new concept, but charitable assumption. So it's something we talk about very publicly at Hungryroot. And it's probably like the go-to tool I use when dealing with managers who often will come to me and say, kind of like, this person was off in a meeting, or, their attention to detail is really off, or it's something that starts as performance related. And so what I encourage them is like charitable assumption. Let's think about kind of all the other plausible scenarios other than they just wanted to do a bad job that might have gone into that. And so starting with just a check-in of like, hey, hey, Lauren, I noticed that like you've been a little off in meetings lately, or haven't been paying attention, or your attention to details off, or I was really disappointed. Like, is there something more going on? So making it comfortable versus an accusation to like really uncover kind of like what's behind the scenes. And oftentimes it could be mental health related. But what I found is kind of caregiving related. I'm like really stressed, or I just had a baby and I'm not sleeping well. So it allows that like ability for a manager to have a really comfortable conversation to get at like the root of the issue, the employee to feel supported and heard, and moves away from just, just assuming kind of they want to do a bad job, because I think it's flipping the script of assuming trust and assuming that we all come and show up every day to do the best that we possibly can do.
I love that charitable lens. And also, I think it calls back to our earlier conversation around vulnerability too, where something that I've tried doing as a manager is sharing more about what's in my space in a one-on-one, for example, to encourage my team to be able to share that back to me as well.
I think one other thought I had too is inspired that, somebody's like, for the caregiver to also just speak up, and making sure that the culture is one that is like, as you said, is like I role model just like sharing vulnerabilities. But, one example I'll give is, as I mentioned earlier, my husband's traveling this week. We have 2 kids, crazy job. And we had an exec meeting that was scheduled at 7 a.m. my time. So that's like the hot zone this morning. And, so I sent our CEO and chief of staff a note saying, if this is the only time that do it, I'm going to make it work, but just know I'm not going to be fully present and have, kids in the background. And the response was like, we have to move the meeting. So not only did I feel supported, but also like making sure that's a culture and like role modeling, kind of speaking up and see where there's like accommodations or adjustment that ended up not having a great impact on anyone else, but had a huge positive impact on me.
I really love that piece about role modeling. Actually, that happened to me recently, where my little guy had roseola, and just like an awful time, where he's running a high fever, and then a few days later he popped up with all these red spots, and I was like, oh my gosh, what is going on? But what I shared to my team is, hey, he's sick today. I'm gonna be not canceling meetings, but I'm gonna be somewhat distracted and very likely taking care of him when I'm not in a meeting. And so I think even just being able to share that was something that I could see for especially the other caregivers in the room, so to speak, at least on Slack, really mattered, where they felt like, okay, if one of our co-founders is sharing that this is going through through her life experience, then I feel more comfortable myself sharing as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And something I'm thinking about more and more too, Carolyn, is what is the actual cost to the employer of not supporting caregivers? Because I think what you were saying is it's the right thing to do, but also at the end of the day, we are all business leaders, whether it's, running a company that um, ultimately has to have results, being a people leader of a company. And I think what really struck me was when I reflected on COVID and thinking about the 2 million women, for example, who left the workforce during COVID as an example of the cost of not having the infrastructure in place. That's a macro cost. That's something that stood out to me. But what I'd love to hear is just some of the costs that you see as a people leader, since this is something I'm sure that as a conversation with your leadership team, whether it's a Hungryroot or at prior companies too.
I mean, the cost is huge. It'd be interesting to do an exercise like back of the envelope exercise to quantify it, but certainly in attrition, I mean, the way that I've seen the cost is more in just engagement. So both engagement of those that are caregivers, but also those that aren't caregivers, because everyone wants to work for a company where the company takes care of employees when it's hard to do. So it's just like we say, it's really easy to take care of employees in good times, like great results, everything's fine. Employees kind of showing up sort of like, traditional 5 days a week. That's pretty easy to do. And it's pretty easy to be a good leader. I think every company wants to see a company show up when it's not as easy to do. So I think the cost is mostly in engagement. And then I think, like, for example, at Hungry, what we do when someone goes on, so parental leave is probably one of the most like common use cases of just leave to care for a child and a newborn, is we make sure that the whole team that's supporting that maternity or paternity or parental leave feels really supported and set up for success, and also feels like appropriately compensated for the additional work that they take on. So it's not only kind of like emotionally supporting them, but rationally supporting them, saying like, okay, we care about this individual and we want to make sure like not only the business is protected, but all of the people involved feel really, really good. And I think that pays off in retention and engagement, as well as performance.
Mm. The piece around caring for not just the person who's on leave, for example, that you mentioned, Carolyn, but the team, for example, really resonates for me because something that I've also heard a lot is just when especially at companies where every person really has such meaningful impact, having someone go on leave can mean there's a pretty meaningful gap that sometimes comes about while they're out. And what I love about what you shared about is that it's not just about supporting that caregiver, for example, who might be on a leave, but also the people who are helping to chip in to really make that work for the company in the interim as well.
Yeah, that's right. Exactly. And it's like, it does take a huge toll on a company where we're pretty like key person dependent. So colleagues do have to take on extra work. So supporting them, it does two things. Is one, it makes sure the work gets done, make sure they feel supported. But the third leg of that school is making sure like they really understand how we support caregivers. And so it deepens their engagement. They may not be in that situation now, but they, just on your stat of 3 out of 4 employees serve in some caregiving capacity. If they're not there now, they are likely to get there at some point.
Mm-hmm. And I think also something that stood out to me from what you shared, Carolyn, was this idea of it's easy to take care of employees when times are good, but you really see the character of a company when times are not good. And that's what employees are looking to. And I think a lot of us are probably experiencing that right now where we're in this environment where there are layoffs happening. For example, the macro environment is really tough. And something that stood out to me when I was starting Cocoon and this concept of leave was I was having a conversation with my people leader at the time at Stripe. And the thing that really stood out from what she shared to me was she said, Lauren, there are a couple of these key inflection points in people's careers. There really aren't that many, but going on leave, whether it's having a baby, for example, or caring for a family member, is one of those really key inflection points in a career where your company can either step up for you or not. And that is where people fall deeply in love with their company because of the way that they were treated during that time, or out of love. And I've thought about that a lot for myself as someone who's in the midst of building a company at Cocoon too, because it's something where we don't necessarily realize that these moments are actually quite few. And I think maybe unintuitively investing in those moments, despite them being relatively rare necessarily, are actually what really show what the company's values are.
That's absolutely right. And I think just to like go one step further, like I couldn't agree more with what you said, but then when you're deeply in love with a company and you like deepen that engagement, you're just like 9.9 times more like out of 10, like in situations where you need a deliverable, you need to stay up an extra hour to get something done. You need to help a colleague out. You need to go out of your way to make sure like, while it might be an inconvenience to you, but that you're getting a business deliverable done, like you're more likely to do it. And just the data does support that.
Yeah, and we recently hosted a manager training for our team here at Cocoon, and I remember the term used for that was discretionary effort.
Yeah.
And it's like that little extra bit of discretionary effort and energy and love and care that goes into the work really only comes if the people feel cared for and engaged, as you were saying too.
Absolutely. And then to think for like a business term like that, like let's say everyone is like 10 times more kind of like just like gives discretionary effort, like how that translates into real business results is it's not a thing of it's nice to do. It actually is like also right by the business to drive the outcome of the company.
Mm-hmm. And just speaking about the macro environment too, Carolyn, something that I'd love to get your practical thoughts on is, as we think about the cost of not caring, it's pretty significant. Whether it's employees who aren't necessarily feeling cared for or able to give their best work, do that discretionary effort, for example, or folks dropping out of the workforce and attrition, for instance, and having to deal with turnover and rehiring and lost knowledge. And so what naturally comes to mind is, what do we as employers do to address this? And a quote that really stood out to me when I was chatting about this topic with Carolyn Frey, who was a former advisor to Michelle Obama in the White House, was she had said infrastructure is not just about fixing potholes and building roads, but it's also about having childcare within a mile of your home. And that really resonated with me because it truly is the case where it just says it's important for us to have roads to be able to get to the office or go where we're going in order to do our best work, or have internet, for example, to do our best work on Zoom. Childcare is also like that, but it's also super expensive. And so what I'm wondering is, when we think about benefits to support caregivers, I think a lot of times our minds might jump straight to, hey, what about subsidizing childcare? Or can we offer childcare? And there's probably select few companies out there who can have the deep pockets to do that. That being said, though, I think where can we start? And I'd love to get your thoughts as someone who is kind of responsible for thinking about this at Hungryroot, of what else have you seen be impactful? And what are these kind of maybe lower cost or micro steps that we can take to move in the right direction?
Yeah, I mean, I think micro steps we can take in the right direction is like flexibility. So like, what are the things that we can control that essentially are free? So we control like how work gets done. So that could be flexibility in the workday, the hours that are worked, how meetings are scheduled. That isn't like obvious. And I think that's not even a baby step. That's probably like a meaningful step, especially for companies that operate mostly in like a remote first environment, but even not. So having great flexibility that can kind of do it all. And that includes like picking up kids from school, just in the context of what, like the example you gave around caregiving. I mean, certainly supporting through kind of other benefits. I mean, mental health support for our caregivers. I mean, it's so hard. We're in service to everyone else. When you're a caregiver, you feel like, okay, I'm in service to my team at work. I'm in service to whoever I'm giving care to. And what about me? So making sure there's really good support and self-care for the individual. Those are some of the things that come to mind in absence of being able to support a, childcare kind of stipend benefit. daycare type of support. Because I think a lot of, especially smaller to mid-sized companies, are probably challenged. Like they're figuring out either the path to profitability or recently profitable. So there is that balance of like, how can we do within our control, but also support the reality of our budgets.
The suggestion around just the flexible work schedule really resonates for me, because something that we've played around with at Cocoon is this hybrid idea where we've got about 60% of our team in the Bay Area that gets to kind of use our amazing office. But also we have, even within folks who are in person, a hybrid environment where there are 2 days of the week where they come in and 3 days where we are working from home holistically. And something that I've personally really appreciated, especially since becoming a parent, is that flexibility where I remember when I was first transitioning back from my own leave, something that was really challenging for me was getting my little guy to take a bottle. And in the beginning, I was actually doing a lot of breastfeeding because it was just, I was like, I don't know, he's going to starve if I don't feed him on my breast. And so being able to do that at home was really, really valuable. And I can imagine for a lot of folks that being the case too.
Yeah. And I even think like back to sort of like, okay, what's within our control and like budget friendly is like also changing the video on. So let's imagine we're in a remote context, like video on culture. So sometimes I might need to be like packing lunches, but I'm listening to the call or doing some kind of chore around the house. So like making it comfortable and or like having norms of like that being acceptable in some scenarios.
Absolutely. That's actually been really key for me, especially because as a pumping mom, I've been, having to dial into meetings with my camera off, for example, and being able to normalize that and not make it something that is strange or off or weird. And I think also having that hybrid environment means that it's more acceptable because you're not necessarily in a physical in-person meeting, and you can actually, for example, in my case, pump and also be present in the meeting at the same time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One thing that I'm really interested to get your tip on, Carolyn, is just around this idea of executive buy-in, especially in this macro environment where things are a bit tougher, just in terms of budgets. What would your advice be to other people leaders who are thinking about bringing in some of these, for example, whether it's something that maybe is not super costly, but is still meaningful, like a hybrid or remote environment or flexibility, or something that does actually have real dollars attached to it, whether it's, for instance, pay during a parental leave or a mental health benefit, for instance. How have you succeeded in getting that kind of executive buy-in, and any tips for this environment too?
Well, look, I mean, everything starts from the top. So I think it has to be role modeled. I mean, I think some of that goes to like the core ethos and values of the company. So I've been really fortunate that the companies I've chosen have aligned with my personal values, and so my personal values around like, do you care about caregiving? I mean, is this something important? And the way I could find that out is as a mother myself. So sort of pressure testing in the interview process. So I think that's number one. And then I think number two is like around really speaking in terms of like engagement and retention. And I think just being a human at the end of the day. So some of these investments would, pay off just as we've discussed in this dialogue. And then I think I like the lens that you brought to it, Lauren. And I think that's really good advice of like baby steps. Sometimes people just try to go from 0 to 100. It's like every step forward is progress, and allows you to sort of like introduce something, measure results, see how that shows up in engagement scores, performance, and then go from there. So you don't need to solve it or kind of like offer like all the bells and whistles from day one. Any step forward is meaningful.
I love that idea of how do we reduce this from 0 to 100 to at least 0 to 1 to start. And then I think also, Carolyn, what you were sharing about it coming from the top in terms of the values and being able to really kind of investigate that before joining as well, and that being something that's really important. And I know that we're also coming up on time, but one thing that came to mind for me that isn't, actually doesn't cost anything, but is something that we care a lot about at Cocoon is sharing data and sharing benchmarks. And something that we publish every year and that I love really kind of putting out into the world is, what are other companies doing around this topic of caregiving, for example? What are the benchmarks around things like parental leave or caregiver leave, for instance, or other benefits? And a call to action that I love to just kind of throw out there to all of our folks on the line right now is please, please, please share your data and your benchmarks, because that is something that concretely makes a difference for folks, people leaders, benefits leaders out there when making the case to their teams around how they can best support this community that we all care about. And Christine, I wanted to also make sure we hand it back to you as you're closing out the conversation too.
Thank you so much, Lauren, and you as well, Carolyn. Thank you both so much for sharing your stories with our community, and thank you to our audience as well for being present throughout this session. Just a note to our audience that if you are interested in learning more about Cocoon solutions, definitely check them out at cocoon.com. We're just also so thankful for you all for being a part of Culture First, and to everybody in our audience, I hope that you enjoyed the rest of today's sessions as well.